So, the proof of the existence of God. That seems to be the main business of the third meditation, and at least in some ways it is the main business of the third meditation, right? It's kind of intricate, all the things that Descartes is going to bring up, and I don't want to talk us through all of it, but I do want to look at it pretty closely, and I want to do so by first asking the question, well, why is Descartes going to prove the existence of God? And why is he going to do it here? Right? I mean, of course, if you can prove the existence of God, by all means do so. That's surely an important philosophical accomplishment. But why is it important for Descartes to do it here in the third meditation? Well, the basic story there seems to be pretty evident. Right? The second meditation shows me that I know my own existence, and in the end, I would say much more importantly, it shows me that I have immediate knowledge, free from all doubt, of the contents of my own mind. Right? I know what I'm thinking. I know the thoughts that are in me. And that's nice. But it doesn't get me very far unless at some point I can get from those contents of my own mind to something that is not in my own mind. Right? Descartes does not want to end up being an idealist. Well, I don't think he thinks that way. He's not like, oh, there will be idealists and I don't want to be one of them. But that's not his purpose, right? He doesn't want to argue that everything is only inside my own mind or something like that. On the contrary, he wants to establish, among other things, the existence of a world of objects around me, right? He wants there to actually be a material world, and he wants to get knowledge of that. How do I get from my thoughts to this world outside me? Well, here's what Descartes starts to do at the beginning of the third meditation. He says, well, I now have some knowledge, and what I should be paying attention to is the question of how I got this knowledge, right? What was so special about this stuff that I could know it, right? That might be the key to coming to know more. And this is where Descartes really starts emphasizing that famous phrase of his, that his ideas are clear and distinct, clair et distinct, or as the translator whose work I've put on Brightspace rather laboriously explains to us, maybe it should be translated with vivid and clear instead of clear and distinct. And maybe he's right, but again, I'll be using the traditional phrase, clear and distinct. So here's what Descartes tells us. He says, I now seem able to posit as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Right? If I look at something, like in my mind's eye, if I think about it, and if it is immediately evident to me by what Descartes is calling the light of nature, if it's so clear to me that I couldn't possibly be deceived about it, that seems to be the stuff that I really know. That seems to be the stuff that I want to have, right? That's where I get my knowledge. Well, okay, Descartes says, but couldn't it be the case that, as I already sort of suggested in Meditation 1, that I'm being deceived in such a way that when I see things very clearly and distinctly, they are nevertheless false, right? Couldn't it be the case that I am, I was created in such a way that happens? And in a sense, Descartes thinks it would be possible, because he thinks that God, if God existed, then God could do everything, right? God could make it the case, according to Descartes, that 1 + 1 is 3. So why couldn't God make it the case that Descartes, when he has a clear and distinct idea, is actually wrong? So here's what Descartes says. He says, I have no reason for thinking that there is a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know whether there even is a God. So the basis for doubting, depending as it does merely on the above hypothesis, is very tenuous, and so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to remove even this basis for doubt, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. And so what Descartes is going to do, which is sort of the overt purpose of the third meditation, and a lot happens in between that maybe I'll talk about in another video, but the overt purpose of the third meditation is to do precisely this, right? To prove that there is a God, and to prove that this God is no deceiver. And of course here we are staring the Cartesian circle in the face, right? I mean, if we really seriously consider the possibility that Descartes might be wrong every time he sees something clearly and distinctly, then why couldn't he be wrong about this proof of the existence of God and prove that God can't be a deceiver? And that's sort of a fundamental difficulty for Descartes, and I just want to put it out there. I want us to recognize that is something that any Cartesian, anyone who is sort of defending the philosophy of Descartes, is going to have to deal with in one way or another. But at the very least, we could say that if Descartes succeeds in proving the existence of God and so on and so forth, at the very least it shows the coherence and consistency of his own philosophy. Right? That's the very least that he could be accomplishing here, even if there is a circle. All right. So how does it work? Right? How do we prove the existence of God? I mean, this is something that thinkers had been thinking about, had been doing, in fact, for centuries. I mean, there are many famous proofs of the existence of God from the Middle Ages. Descartes is actually going to sort of bring out something that looks a lot like Anselm's ontological proof later on, I think in Meditation 5, if I'm not mistaken. But here in Meditation 3, Descartes is going to give us a proof that is deeply original. Right? This is really Descartes' proof of the existence of God. And it's a proof that really fits very well with the entire logic, the entire framework, the entire story of the Meditations. Because where we are now at this point is we are just considering our own ideas, our own mental states. That's the only thing that we really know. And that is where Descartes is going to start in proving the existence of God. Right, in our own ideas. And so what Descartes does is he says, well, let's think about the kinds of ideas that I have. Right? Some of them might be innate, right? I just have them. Some of them might be coming from outside. Some of them might be fictitious. And then there are some passages about material falsity and things like that, where he's going to argue that for instance, ideas can be misleading. Descartes talks about the true and the false in general, and those are things that we might want to come back to later. But I'm going to skip a little bit through that and come to the proof of the existence of God. Now, this proof of the existence of God is going to depend crucially, first, on the distinction between the different levels of reality, right? Where Descartes said that there is formal reality and objective reality, also known as intrinsic and representational reality. Formal reality and objective reality. Where the formal reality, again, was the reality that something has by being the kind of thing that it is. So I, presumably, have the formal reality of being, like, I as my mind, right? That's who I am, according to Descartes. I have the formal reality of being a substance. My thoughts, such as my thought that I should have turned off the sound of my phone because now you heard beep on the recording, that's a mode of me, of the substance that is me. And so that has the formal reality of a mode. But there is also this thing called objective reality, and that is the reality that we can ascribe to ideas, based on what they represent. If they represent a mode, they have the objective reality of a mode. If they represent a substance, they have the objective reality of a substance. Okay. Here is what Descartes is going to do. He is going to use this idea to analyze the fact that he has an idea of God, that he finds in himself an idea. As an idea, it necessarily has the formal reality of a mode, but it's an idea of God, which means that its objective reality is going to be the reality of substance, and not just of substance, but of infinite substance, right? The highest rank in the hierarchy of Descartes' ontology. Now that actually doesn't bring us anywhere. I mean, if that's all we have, we can't prove the existence of God. So Descartes is going to need an extra premise, an extra something, that brings us from having the idea of God to the existence of God. And here is that extra premise. It is the most clear and distinct. No, that's actually not the phrase that I want to read out. So let me pause the recording and go back once I found the quotation I actually want to read to you. Good. Yeah. So here is what Descartes writes. He says, "Now it is indeed evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause." So here is Descartes giving us a general principle about causation. And it's something that we'll definitely come back to in our lecture on causation later on in the course. But Descartes' basic idea here is that a cause and an effect, that any effect can only be caused by something that has at least as much reality, formal reality, intrinsic reality, as the effect. This is actually a more abstract and in many ways more permissive idea than an idea about causation that is quite traditional and that Descartes would certainly have known, and which in fact sometimes he seems to invoke, but not here, which is that any effect must, in a sense, already be present in its cause. So suppose that you want to heat something up, right? You want to make something hot. How do you do that? You have a glass of water, you want to make it hot, you put it next to a fire, maybe. What happens? Well, the fire is hot, and it transfers its hotness to the water, and then you have hot water. And so you might come up with this idea that any effect must already be present in the cause, right? Hot things can heat up other things. Cold things can cool down other things. And this was actually, I mean, a very prevalent thought among many thinkers, even though it has some relatively, I would say, obvious difficulties, which you would have to take some care to deal with. For instance, if I do this, well, you know, the cause seems to be movement and the effect seems to be heat, right? My hands are feeling hotter right now. Okay. That's not what Descartes is saying, right? Descartes is not saying that only heat can create heat, or only cold can create cold, or only green things can create green things, or something like that. But he is using a more abstract principle of the same form, which tells us that nothing can have effects at a higher level of reality than itself. So Descartes is going to say that a mode might be created by another mode, right? So being circular, the fact that a cookie is circular could be because the cookie cutter was circular. So it's one circularity that creates another circularity. That's great. One mode is having as effect another mode. But Descartes thinks no mode could create a substance, could have a substance as effect, because you just can't get the reality from anywhere. Right? Circularity can't generate a new substance. Substances can create substances maybe, or have substances as an effect, but not modes. Modes can't have substances as an effect. There's no problem in substances having modes as an effect, because the substance is more real than the mode. In the same way, of course, Descartes is going to argue that finite substances couldn't possibly create God, who is the infinite substance. Whereas on the other hand, there's no problem with an infinite substance, God, to create finite substances, because they have less reality. Okay, so far, maybe so good, right? I mean, we could ask questions about that, but let's say so far so good, because Descartes is going to bring forward a much more difficult and I would say controversial thought very, very soon. So he says, it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing. That's a venerable causal statement there. And also that what is more perfect, that is, what contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. So here perfection is understood in terms of levels of reality, and Descartes believes that what is more perfect, what is more real, can't come into existence from what is less real. But, and now the crucial thing comes, this is manifestly true, not merely for those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also for ideas in which only objective reality is considered. And so Descartes is bringing forth the following principle. He says, an idea, it's only a mode, right? So you could say it can be created by another mode. But when we look at an idea, we also have to consider its formal reality. We also have to consider what it is about. And then we will see that, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be created by what it is about, right? So if I have the idea of a unicorn, maybe it doesn't have to be created by a unicorn, but being the idea of a substance, it has at least to be created by a substance, a finite substance, maybe by a horse and a horn that I have seen and that have generated in me this idea of a unicorn. Or maybe by me myself, I mean I'm a substance too, so maybe I can generate this idea. That's okay for Descartes. Alright, so Descartes is bringing forward as a principle this idea that the idea of X needs to have a cause that has at least as much reality as X. An idea of a mode might be created by a mode, an idea of a finite substance might be created by a finite substance, and of course, and crucially, the idea of an infinite substance must be created by an infinite substance. How does Descartes know this? Right? Where is this premise coming from? Well, I think it's fair to say that Descartes' proof of the existence of God has never become very popular. Right? Not many people ever have accepted that it really proves the existence of God. And probably its most obvious flaw is precisely this principle. I mean, not only do you have to buy into Descartes' ontological hierarchy, but you also have to buy into this principle about objective reality of ideas, saying something about the formal reality of their cause. And Descartes, although he tells us a story about why you should accept this, is not, in the end, many would say, that persuasive. Alright, but I'm going to sort of leave that for what it is, right? I'm not too interested in finding out whether Descartes' proof of the existence of God really works or not, because, well, in a sense, every Descartes commentator I've ever read agrees that it doesn't really work, the proof of the existence of God. But it is a very, very interesting proof in many ways, because it teaches us a lot about Descartes, it teaches us a lot of philosophy, and there are some really genius ideas coming on along the way. So here's one thing that Descartes needs to do now. right? In order for the rest of his argument to work, he needs to persuade us that we have the idea of God, right? And in a sense, this is an introspective claim, right? Descartes says, oh, I look inside myself and I see that I have the idea of God, of an infinite substance, which has all perfections, which depends on nothing, and so on and so forth. Now, crucially, what he has to say is that there is more reality in God than in us, right? He needs to establish this ontological hierarchy. And I think this is one of the great passages from the third meditation, so let me read it out. Descartes says, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than there is in a finite one. Thus the perception of the infinite is somehow prior in me to the perception of the finite. That is, my perception of God is prior to my perception of myself. So Descartes wants to think about the relation between God and us as, an ontological hierarchy, so a little bit akin to the distinction between us and modes, between substances and modes. And of course, if we look at this pencil, we might want to say something that, well, I have to understand that there's a pencil before I can understand the idea that the pencil is yellow, right? That it has this mode of yellowness. I want to say something like that, Descartes says. I want to say something like, if God is more real than us, it means that he is prior in any understanding that we have of the world, right? He's prior in reality, but he's also, I'm just looking at my ideas, he's sort of prior in any understanding that I have of the world. I perceive God before I perceive myself. I know God before I know myself. That's what Descartes is suggesting. And this seems really weird. Surely, in meditation too, he has proven the existence of himself, not the existence of God. So it seems that the meditations are clearly pointing out that we know ourselves a lot better than we know God. No, and this is where, the genius of this passage is going to come out. No, Descartes is going to say, I have been having God in view since the first sentence of the first meditation, even if I didn't realize it. And this is what he writes. For how would I understand that I doubt and that I desire? That is, that I lack something and that I am not wholly perfect, unless there were some idea in me of a more perfect being, by comparison with which I might recognize my defects. So what Descartes is saying, that when I started doubting in meditation 1, well, in order to doubt, in order to think of myself as somebody whose knowledge is not good, whose knowledge is not perfect, who is epistemically defective, I have to be able to compare myself with an entity who is epistemically perfect, who has this perfect knowledge. Doubt is comparison with some ideal and finding myself lacking. And that ideal of perfection is, of course, God. Right? I think of God, I compare myself with God, even if sort of subconsciously, and that's when I realize that I am just this very imperfect, finite being whose knowledge isn't very good, whose will might be evil, and so on and so forth. So already Descartes is suggesting from sentence 1 of the first meditation, when I engaged in methodical doubt, I was relying on the idea of God, and a sort of understanding of God and my relation to God was always there in the background. And so I have the idea of God, and I immediately understand that God has more reality than I have. And that generates the question of how I got this idea. Right? And now we can maybe also start seeing or feeling why Descartes thinks that this proof is persuasive. Persuasive in ways that are not apparent if we just look at his abstract formulation. Right? The abstract formulation that says, the cause of any idea must have at least as much formal reality as the idea has objective reality. Well, that's abstract and maybe not very, why would I believe that? But if somebody says, I have this idea of a perfection. I even judge myself by the idea of this perfection. How did I get that idea? Right? How, if I'm so imperfect, can I even know that I'm imperfect? How can I look beyond myself unless there is a beyond myself to look up to? Right? That is sort of the underlying sort of stream of persuasiveness here, even if the argument itself looks a little bit different. So I do think that Descartes very clearly thinks that he's onto something here. And I think we can understand a little bit why he thinks that. And maybe even feel that a little bit. And then, I want to call this out not because it's really important, but because, again, this is for me like one of these points where Descartes is just such a good philosopher. Right? A good philosopher is somebody who takes their ideas and then, well, maybe there are many ways of being a good philosopher, but one of the ways of being a good philosopher, maybe crucial to any kind of good philosophy, is to take this idea and really push it and consider it from every angle, try every thought and see what works. And what Descartes is doing here is he is actually going to consider, he's actually going to say, okay, I have the idea of God. I'm going to claim that there must be a God. Well, there seems to be one logical option left on the table. I don't necessarily have to postulate a God. If I am God, right? If I am God, if I am the perfect being, then it's not so strange where this idea of perfection is coming from, and I don't need to posit anything outside of my mind. Of course, it's crazy, right? I mean, what could be more crazy than thinking that you're God? But Descartes does it, right? He does say, ooh, perhaps I am something greater than I myself understand. Perhaps all these perfections that I am attributing to God are somehow in me potentially, although they do not yet assert themselves and are not yet actualized. So he is saying, maybe I'm not God in the full sense of the word, because if I really had perfect understanding, I wouldn't be in a situation of doubt, right? But maybe I'm becoming God. Maybe all that God is in me potentially. I'm sort of growing into it. I don't have perfect knowledge yet, but, just wait a little bit and I'm going to turn out to be God. He takes it seriously enough to write it down and think it through. And of course his answer is going to be that no, because my idea of God shows that, God is always already perfect. He's not potential. He doesn't have, that would be an imperfection according to Descartes. But he really considers this, whether he himself maybe could, in the end, be God. No, well, not. And so Descartes concludes that his idea of God can only come from God. There must be a God, because only God has the reality needed to create the idea of God. And that is sort of the proof that he wanted to give. At least the proof of the existence of God. We need to add a little something to that I will get to in a moment. One thing I would like to just say before we come to that end point. So there's this one passage that I would like to read out, because it's going to be pretty important for our understanding of modern thinking about causation later on. Here's what Descartes says. He's sort of considering possibilities that he was created by something else, by his parents or by himself or whatever. And then he says that, well, from the fact that I existed a short time ago, it doesn't follow that I must exist now, unless some cause, as it were, creates me all over again at this moment. That is to say, which preserves me. For it is obvious to one who pays close attention to the nature of time that plainly the same force and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment that it lasts, as would be required to create that same thing anew, were it not yet in existence. Thus, conservation differs from creation solely by virtue of a distinction of reason. This too is one of those things that are manifest by the light of nature. So here's something again that is manifest by the light of nature. As soon as I think about it, I see it. And it is the claim that things don't just continue existing in and of themselves. It is the claim that at any moment of time, everything, in a sense, has to be caused again. So you might think, well, there's a cup here, and if nothing happens to it, if there's no causation, then it just remains this cup forever. But that's not what Descartes is thinking, and that's not what a lot of people in the 17th century, but also the 16th, 15th, and so forth centuries would say. They would say that, no, look, if no causation is taking place, then there won't be a cup the next moment. There will be nothing the next moment, because how could anything exist without it being sustained in its existence, without it being given reality? And Descartes thinks that this is totally clear, right? It's manifest by the light of nature. This is the strongest thing that he can say about something. It is absolutely clear and certain that anything that continues existing must, in a sense, be created anew at every single moment. And of course, things can't do that themselves, Descartes would say. I mean, this cup can't create itself from nothing. You never see nothing and then suddenly, bam, a cup comes into existence because it has created itself from nothing. But if a cup can't create itself from nothing, then it also can't sustain itself through time. And so here we have like a super classic argument. I believe this is one of Thomas Aquinas' arguments, actually. A super classic argument for the existence of God. Right? The world needs to be preserved or sustained in its existence, and only God, the only thing in the world that can create itself, create is maybe not the right word, that can cause itself. God is necessary to keep the world there. Okay, having said that, I mean, that's something that we'll come back to in our lectures on causation. So having said that, let us move to the very end of Meditation 3, because what has Descartes done? He has proved the existence of God, which is great, but he wanted to do a little bit more, right? He wanted to show that God exists and is not a deceiver, right? In order to argue that when I see something by the light of nature, it must be true, we need to know that God is not a deceiver. We now know that God exists, but what about being not a deceiver? Luckily, Descartes thinks that you don't need that much argument for that. So, God, I say, that same being, the idea of whom is in me, a being having all those perfections that I cannot comprehend, but can somehow touch with my thought, and a being subject to no defects whatever. From these considerations, it is quite obvious that he cannot be a deceiver, for it is manifest by the light of nature that all fraud and deception depend on some defect. Right? So what Descartes is saying is, he's saying, well, if you want to deceive someone, that's maybe a moral defect or maybe some other kind of defect, but there's something wrong there. But there's nothing wrong with God. God is perfect. And so God couldn't possibly have that kind of motivation, right, to want to deceive something, to engage in fraud. That's not very godlike. So God can't be a deceiver. That's the entire argument. And I think here too, I mean, one might have question marks. I mean, Descartes has set up the argument in terms of deception and claiming that God, if God is perfect, then God can't be a deceiver. That sounds kind of plausible. But, you know, maybe God has reasons that we don't understand that make it the case that it is best, in some way we can't understand, that we are all deceived. I mean, who knows? Well, not deceived, maybe that's not the right word, but that we think things that have very little to do with reality. That is clearly not the way that Descartes is conceiving of God. Right? The God of Descartes is clearly a God who, in some sense at least, cares about human beings. Right? This is sort of a fundamental assumption, I would say, of Descartes' meditations here. He doesn't spell it out. It's natural enough in his sort of religious surroundings. But there seems to be an unstated assumption here that God is interested in humans, right? And that God has, in some sense, our best interests at heart and is going to create the world in such a way that it is germane and helpful to us, right? This is not some uncaring God who has just created human beings without any specific moral connection to them or anything like that. So it's good to be aware of that. But if we accept all of the stuff that Descartes does, if we agree with Descartes about all the things that are supposed to be manifest in the light of nature, then the third meditation has done what it has to do. Right? Prove not only God, but also that God is not a deceiver. And we're going to see where that gets us later on. But definitely what it's going to do for us is it's going to open up the possibility that we can get from inside our mind to outside our mind. That's sort of the bridge that God is going to be.